So they're circling the water for a couple of days, but Coast Guard starts arriving, the police start arriving, and they realize something a bit more serious has taken place on this cruise ship. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or to it if this is the first time you are seeing this face. Thank you for clicking on it. My name is Jacy and I like to do story times on this channel. And I have actually done a part 1 of this video, and that was my cruise ship horror story. So make sure to check out that video. But I have been traveling for the past 3 months. I've been documenting it over on my vlog channel if you want to check it out. But I have acquired more secondhand story times. And one of them was involving a crazy cruise story that I just had to tell to you guys, but it'll be part my stories, part secondhand story times. But if you like hanging out with me and hearing stories that range from the crazy insane to the tame and mundane, make sure to like this video. It really helps me out, and that I know you guys like, I don't know, chit-chatting with me. But with that being said, let's hop into some of these crazy cruise storytime snippets. So the first storytime snippet will be my own story time, and I honestly could make it sound a lot crazier than it probably was. But it was still a pretty scary situation when it was happening. And this was several years ago. My mom, sister, and I took a cruise to Mexico as one of our girls trips that we usually do every year. So on these girls trips, you know, we usually go to the bar and we get a couple of 2-for-1 cocktails, or, you know, we're always getting dressed up for our dinners every night. And I remember specifically my mom was trying out false eyelashes for the first time, and I bought hair extensions, and we just had a great time getting all dressed up. But a big reason for that is because on these cruise ships, they have photographers everywhere. So every time you go to dinner or every time you pass by one of their backdrops, they always have photographers and you can stop by and take a photo. And it's very much like those rides at Disneyland where it's free to take the photo, but then you obviously have to go and buy the photo if you want to purchase it. So on one of the nights, we get all dressed up, we go and we take some photos. And then the next day we went into their room where they have all the photos. But what's interesting is back in the day, and I haven't been on a cruise in recent years, so I don't know if this is still the case, but back in the day, let's say 7 years ago, they would physically print all of the photos, and you would go into this room and every single photo that they took were placed into slots, like little plastic slots. And you would go and grab the photos that you wanted to buy and just walk up and pay for them, which was very wasteful. Because if you didn't want the photos, they're still printing them. They're just gonna throw them away. I really hope they've gone digital and have saved some overhead costs, because that was pretty wasteful in hindsight. But one day, my mom, my sister, and I, we get all dressed up with our falsies and our hair extensions. We go to a backdrop, take some fun photos, and then we go to the room to check out the photos. We saw that they were printed, we saw that they were in the sleeve, and we kind of thought oh, cool, we'll come back and buy all of our photos at the end of the trip. Kind of go through which ones we physically wanted to buy. We didn't want to jump the gun too early. So the next day, same thing, we get all dressed up for dinner, we go, we have our drinks, we have our fun. We go back to the room to see how our photos turned out in our new outfits, in our new hair extensions. And our photos were gone. And we went up to the person and we're like, hey, do you guys throw away the photos right away? Should we have bought them yesterday? And they explained to us nope, we keep up all of the photos. What we actually do is we kind of learn the cruise guests in a way, and we're able to match them, and we'll keep compiling your photos one behind the other. So they said go to where your photos were originally, and we kind of put the new ones in front and just kind of keep adding to that stack, if that makes sense. And obviously their system isn't perfect. They can't memorize every single person and match it up. So they said, oh, it may have been moved, keep looking around. We're looking around and we're we don't see where our photos are. We can't find them. And we kind of told him when we took the photos, where they might be. He reprints them and kind of gives us a new slot, and was just okay, no worries. Here's where I'll keep your photos. In this slot right here, I'll keep adding them. And I think a big part of this was, one, just great customer service. But two, we were telling them we were interested buyers. We just didn't want to buy them as we go along. We wanted to compare. So yeah, that's a roundabout way of saying that okay, cool, here's where your photos will be. Night number 3 comes. We do the same thing, you know, do the same routine. We go and then check on our photos. And again, this man had reprinted all of our photos and they were all missing. And yeah, you know, you might be thinking like, I don't know, maybe somebody is misplacing them or they are kind of shuffling them around. But we kind of started getting scared, realizing that somebody was probably taking our photos. They could have been buying them, but what this employee explained to us is they were like, you know what? Somebody might be taking your photos. Now, my family and I, we watch a lot of true crime. We know all about Natalie Holloway, and our brains immediately go to, oh boy, my sister and I are probably being targeted for human trafficking right now, and we just gave them free photos to sell us off before kidnapping us off once we get off the port in Mexico and they're able to steal us and sell us. That's what's going through our mind, at least. And this is where I'm saying, like, I could embellish this even more and be like, oh, that's when we learned they sold our photos, blah, blah, blah. Nope, that's kind of how the story ends, is that every single time we went back to find our photos, they were missing. They kind of assigned us a slot and they still kept going missing. And I think by the end of the trip, we did go directly to the person and see the digitals and buy which ones we wanted. But it was one of those scary situations where we're like, were we being like fleshed out before we landed at port? And like, could we have been a target of human trafficking? And I don't want to say that that's the case because I have done another video. Make sure to check it out, where I was in a sketchy motel and something happened where people did tell me that that was a tactic for human trafficking. So I don't want to be the one to cry wolf and be like, everybody wants to kidnap me. But I don't know. Pretty suspicious that our photos kept going missing on an isolated cruise ship at sea. That's all I'm saying. That's the 2 cents I wanted to put in with my own personal cruise ship story time. But let's hop into the next one that's a little bit more tangible. So that story time was creepy, but this next story time is very eerie, and it is a secondhand story time of a person I will call Margot. So Margot goes on a cruise ship to the ocean. Duh, all these stories are about cruises. You got to be on water somewhere. I don't know specifically where she's going, but she is on a vacation on a cruise ship. So night one, they're sailing through the night, and in the next day, they wake up to kind of this announcement over the cruise intercom. I'm not quite sure if that's exactly how it worked, but they are told that there has been a change in the itinerary because due to inclement weather at their destination port, it was not safe to dock, and so for the day they would have to kind of drive around the ocean for a little bit. Now this has actually happened to me before. I guess I have been on cruises. I don't know, my mom loves to cruise. She's probably been on like a dozen cruises if I have to guess. She just loves sailing the open seas with all you can eat scallops and lobsters. Anyway, I've been on cruises before where this has happened, where there's bad weather in Ensenada, Mexico, where we're supposed to land. And so instead they kind of spend the day just doing donuts in the ocean because we didn't have an excursion at the port, so we aren't too heartbroken. But really, for cruises, you're there to, you know, drink the free booze, stand by the swimming pool, and I don't know, get some weird karaoke nights in. So it's happened before, and that is a viable excuse. So Margot and her family are like, oh dang, like we can't make it to our destination port, but that's fine, we're here to enjoy the cruise ship. So the ship kind of turns around what it looks like and is just floating in the sea. That's when they notice Coast Guard starting to arrive. People on little lifeboats doing some speedy things and looking real suspicious. Margot also sees some of these Coast Guard come onto board, and they looked like, let's say, governmental authoritative figures. That's when alarm bells start going off that, I don't know if there's bad weather where we're going, because we just gave it a goog and it's not bad enough for us to completely avoid. Something else fishy is going on here. No pun intended, because they're in the ocean. So the crew members are evidently more frantic, and there's a lot more chitter-chatter among the cruise passengers because something else is clearly going on. There are Coast Guard boats coming in and out. There is a noticeable presence of police officers on board, and that's when they realize, uh-oh, somebody probably went overboard, unfortunately. So after what has been a very frazzled environment on this cruise ship, they are actually all gathered for a safety talk. I don't know how to quite phrase that, but if you've ever been on a cruise, you all have to get together and like learn how to put your lifeboat vests on and, you know, hear all the safety stuff. There was kind of a collective meeting that was called among all passengers, and that is where the captain informs everybody that yes, somebody did indeed go overboard, but the Coast Guard has now taken over the investigation, so they will be going to their next port of destination. So that's already terrifying in and of itself, that you're on a cruise where somebody goes overboard. Like, that's absolutely terrifying. That's everybody's worst nightmare. They don't know who it was, what was going on, but it's not like the captain's going to be telling them all the details. But it wasn't until a week later, once their cruise vacation had ended, that they found out the true horrors that had taken place on their specific cruise. So that first night where they were sailing throughout the night, apparently a woman had gone overboard. And she wasn't reported missing until the next morning, which is when the cruise ship went into emergency mode, immediately turned around and tried to pinpoint the exact spot where she may have gone overboard. Now, this information was given to the captain and the crew by her husband. And in order to not raise alarm, not ruin everybody's vacation, that's where, you know, they kind of give the code of, sorry guys, we can't go to our port because we have to possibly go save a life and start an investigation here. But I guess it was pretty apparent at the beginning that this was going to be a homicide investigation, because as it turns out, a week later, as Margot discovered, the husband was the one who pushed his own wife off of that cruise ship that night in the darkness and did not report it until the next day. Cruise ship officials were able to pull up video evidence and surveillance and kind of piece the puzzle together, and was able to identify the husband as a murderer, essentially. So not only did the Coast Guard have to get involved to try to recover the body, try to figure out where all this happened, but the police had to come on board, because now they have a murder suspect who potentially killed his own wife, pushed her overboard and into the ocean abroad, which is devastating for this woman who was going on vacation with her husband. And it's so eerie because, again, I watch a lot of true crime, and you hear about stories like this. Like, you hear about how easy it is to go missing on cruise ships and how murders like this happen all the time. But for somebody like Margot, who was just on the cruise ship and was an innocent bystander in all of this, that's so scary to think about, how something like this is happening a couple of decks above you and you don't even know about it. So scary stuff, because, you know, Margot probably had a great time on her vacation as it was happening, but in hindsight, that is probably one of the most terrifying trips she'll ever remember. So stay safe on cruise ships, because you never know who you can trust when you're out in the open seas. And the last story time snippet that I wanted to tell, I honestly thought was just fascinating. It wasn't so much crazy. I mean, it is pretty crazy and it is pretty devastating, but it made me fall down a rabbit hole in researching all this, because I just thought it was so interesting. So I met a girl recently who was telling me the story of how she was on a cruise and her very own grandfather died. So they were going on a cruise in the Caribbean, and as it happens on cruises, you know, you're overeating, you're over drinking, you're probably overexerting because you're walking around a whole bunch, you're swimming, you're participating in activities. And her grandfather was not a young man, you know, he wasn't in the best of health, but as it turns out, he probably just overexerted himself, and one morning she woke up and he was not getting out of bed. She immediately called for medical services, medical professionals arrived, they immediately assessed the body, but they were unable to revive him. I think what she said is that he probably had an aneurysm in his sleep. Long story short, he essentially died in his sleep, died in his bunk bed in the cruise, and had perished on this vacation. But it was the aftermath that she was telling me about this that was something that I've never ever thought about, because people pass away every single day and people die on cruise ships. But what does that process actually look like? So what she described to me was that they kind of immediately assessed that he was unrecoverable and he was dead. And the crew remained very discreet. You know, no alarms were raised, no emergency announcement was made over the intercom. They kind of quietly dealt with this situation where essentially they removed him from the room and discreetly took him downstairs into a separate area, kind of away from other eyes. And she was very grateful that he did pass away in his sleep. I mean, that's always the ideal situation, but also that it didn't happen in front of other people, that it wasn't a big scene, that it wasn't some type of aneurysm where it would be public and everybody would be worried and cause panic. No, it kind of happened very quietly and very discreetly, and that's how it was handled. So his body was taken down to the lowest level, and it was taken down to the cruise ship morgue. I knew that cruise ships had morgues, but to hear a firsthand account from somebody who was experiencing it from a grieving perspective was so sad to hear, because she described it as like a small refrigerated room with about 5 sections that you could put a body. Now, she didn't spend too much time in here, but this is where I did some research. Every single cruise ship has a morgue that can hold 3 to 5 bodies at any time. Because again, a lot of these cruises, the passengers are of old age. A lot of people, turns out, go on cruises to retire. They get to eat for free, live for free, have all the free entertainment. That's where a lot of people do go to die. And I read a lot of differing stats, but kind of the median statistic that I found was that about 5 people die of natural causes on cruise ships every single week. And that might be too many. A lot of places also said like 5 people every 2 weeks, but people are dying of natural causes on these cruise ships. And the fact that, people die and that these cruise ship employees have to deal with that death, but then put their bodies in a morgue, have a staff of medical professionals to deal with those medical emergencies, was not something that I think about when I'm taking these cruises and I'm doing the little beach surf riding wave thing and, and going and eating my all-you-can-eat pizza. And it was just such an eerie thing to think about. But what I also found interesting is that this person I was talking to said that once they took the body down into the morgue, they essentially were assigned somewhat of a grief counselor. Now, that might not be the technical term, but there was a staff member who immediately took them aside and served as a person to give them the tools and the next steps for what to do, but also served as that middleman for grieving, kind of giving them therapeutic tips, really showing their empathy and explaining how, apologetic they were for that this happened. And they asked them if they would like to go to the private chapel that was on board, or if they would like to speak to one of the ministers that were on board to perform any final rites. And this is also something that I never thought about on a cruise ship. I didn't realize that cruise ships had chapels, had churches, had places where you can go for prayer, where you can go and continue your own religious beliefs. But the fact that they offered, a minister, a priest, that person to perform the final rites, that there was somebody on staff to do that, again, it's just one of those things of like, wow, ignorance is bliss. That's so sad that they have that as an option, but it is something that people would take advantage of and would need in those times of grief. Here's where it gets logistical, but also really sad, in my opinion, is this grief counselor that was talking to them said, okay, here are the next logistical steps in what we have to do. I guess that the rule of thumb, and it varies by countries and locations, again, I did some research, but it's not really that important, but you can keep a body in the cruise ship morgue for about a week. But on longer cruises, that's not really an option, and typically they like to remove the body from the cruise ship as soon as possible. So this counselor was telling them the logistics of the next steps, and that would be they were arriving at their next port the next day, and they would have to offboard the body, and then the grieving family would have to take it from there. So what they did is they arrived to port early, and this family who had their dead grandfather had to be the first ones to disembark. So they had to wake up bright and early, and they have to get off board with this body. The counselor then kind of set them up with an appointment to go and get a death certificate for their grandfather. From there, it was just an endless stream of paperwork in the sense of death certificates, in the sense of health insurance and life insurance, but also the next steps of getting the body back to America. Because again, they were at this port, they were not in their home country, and they now had to ship this body back to where they came from, which is so weird to think about. This friend that I was talking to also mentioned that the country in which they had landed for their port, there was a language barrier and there was a lot of paperwork and a lot of logistical things that they just weren't understanding. So they had to get the US Embassy involved in order to help with those translation services, but to also make sure that all their ducks were in a row in terms of the paperwork. From there, the body was then set up to be flown back within the next few days. But obviously their crews had left. They had stayed in this port for a couple of days in order to sort out this situation. Not only is their vacation ruined and they're devastated by the death of this loved one, but now they had to get themselves back home to America and wait for the body to be returned. Now, the interesting thing that I found about all of this, and I think all of it's interesting and sad and devastating, but the fact that they had to cover the cost of all of this. They had to be the ones to cover the cost of sending the body back, getting their own flights back, you know, disembarking early cost money, the death certificate, all of that involved, this friend was saying cost thousands and thousands of dollars. That of course was unexpected, but was also a huge financial hit to their family that was just trying to take their once a year vacation. But she did mention, and this is again something else that I found fascinating, was after a couple of weeks, that same cruise ship grief counselor followed up just to make sure that everything went smoothly, how they were doing mentally, and really being that empathetic person, kind of just sharing how sorry they were that this happened to them on vacation. And I thought that was really nice because, you know, these things happen all the time, but when you have a family member pass away like that, to know that there's somebody in your corner who cares and is checking up on you, I don't know, I just thought that was really nice to hear. But such a sad situation anytime a family member dies, but to have it be on vacation, to have to go through all those logistical loopholes is just so sad, and that's just something I wanted to share, that, you know, you got to stay safe on all these trips, but there are so many things that you might not be aware of when you go on these trips. I didn't realize that cruise ship had morgues, and I don't realize the aftermath of a tragedy that could happen, whether it's somebody getting pushed overboard or whether somebody has an aneurysm in their sleep. So just really sad, but I wanted to share that with you guys to see if you had any similar situations, any other crazy vacation story times, because I just think some of that stuff is, keep using the word interesting, but it's sad, but it's interesting. But those were some of my cruise story time snippets, you know, ranging from all over the place. I've heard a handful of crazy stories over the past few months, and, you know, they're just some snippets that I wanted to share with you guys. But as usual, let me know in the comments if any of these stories resonated with you, if you have any cruise story times you want to share, or any sort of weird death situationships that you got caught in the middle of. I want to know about them. But thank you guys so much for tuning in and for hanging out with me. I'm glad to be back doing story times, and I hope to continue them. You just gotta engage with this video so you can help me out so I don't get discouraged. But I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next video. Toodles! I guess here's a bonus snippet. One time I went on a cruise ship, and I have no self-control when it comes to buffets, and I ate so much that I secretly went into the bathroom at night and I puked it all up. And I didn't tell my mom or my sister because I have a history with buffets and puking and not being able to control myself. But cruise ship is the best place to do it because there are no limits when it comes to food and alcohol and those things. So stay safe out there, kids.